I first noticed the silence. Mrs. Holloway had always been quiet, but there was a rhythm to her presence. A flicker of her porch light when she took out the trash, the slow, deliberate movement of her curtains in the early morning, the soft hum of her television in the evenings. Small, mundane signs of life. And then one day, they were gone. At first, it barely registered. Maybe she was visiting family. Maybe she had taken a fall and was in the hospital. These things happened. But as the days passed, her absence stretched out like an unfinished thought. Her mailbox became swollen with uncollected letters, stuffed with flyers and bills curling at the edges from exposure. The garden she tended so carefully, trimming the hedges into perfect little boxes, pulling weeds with gloved hands, was unraveling, strands of ivy creeping over the walkway, dandelions pushing through the cracks. Even the neighborhood cats, who she fed with bits of chicken and scraps of bread, seemed to hesitate on her doorstep before retreating. But what unsettled me the most was the light. Every evening, just after sunset, the upstairs bedroom window glowed with the soft yellow hue of an old-fashioned lamp. It happened at the same time each night, without fail. I reasoned with myself. Maybe she had a timer, an automatic switch for when she was away. Elderly people did that, didn't they? But the thought didn't sit well. A few times I stood at my window and watched. The light never flickered, never moved, just sat there, illuminating the lace curtains that had once swayed in the breeze. Now, they hung motionless, stiff, as if something behind them was holding its breath. Weeks passed. The neighborhood moved on. Someone should have called someone, but no one did. It was easier to assume that someone else had already done it. The world functioned on that kind of negligence. I told myself it wasn't my business. But one night I woke up, cold sweat clinging to my back, convinced I had heard something. It came from across the street. A sound, faint but deliberate. The kind of noise that didn't belong to an empty house. I sat up, still half dreaming, and listened. The noise came again. A slow, rhythmic creak like the groan of a rocking chair. Then, shuffling footsteps. My pulse ticked faster. I turned to the window, expecting nothing, expecting stillness. But the bedroom light was on. It was always on. The curtains shifted slightly, just enough for a shadow to pass across them. It moved in a way that didn't make sense. My stomach tightened. The house had been empty for weeks. I was sure of it. But someone or something was inside. The call felt ridiculous even as he made it. There was no crime, no emergency, just an old woman's absence and a creeping, inexplicable sense that something was wrong. The light, the noises, the slow unraveling of her home. It all sat in his mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. The officers arrived faster than he expected. They stood on her porch, knocking, calling her name. No answer. The door locked. A few exchanged glances, the unspoken decision made. The wooden frame groaned under the weight of force, and then, with a final sharp crack, the door swung inward. The smell hit first. Not the overpowering stench of rot, but something dry, stale, like an attic sealed shut for years. The air inside was thick, unmoving. The officers stepped inside, boots pressing onto a floor coated in a fine layer of dust. Dust that should not have been there. Not in a house where a light still burned every night. The living room was neat. Too neat. No clutter, no stray newspapers or forgotten coffee cups. Everything seemed arranged. The couch cushions were perfectly aligned, the doilies on the armrests pristine. A house untouched by time. But in the kitchen, something fell off. A plate sat on the table, the edges of the ceramic still smudged with condensation from freshly cooked food. Steam curled faintly from the surface. A meal left untouched, waiting. But waiting for who? Upstairs, the smell thickened. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar. One of the officers reached for it, pushing it open just enough to let the dim glow from the bedside lamp spill into the hallway. The light, always on, always burning, revealed a shape on the bed. Mrs. Holloway, or what was left of her. Her body lay perfectly still, sunken into the mattress. Skin stretched taut over brittle bone, lips pulled back in a silent, eternal grimace. Deep, empty sockets stared at the ceiling, as if she had died looking at something the world was not meant to see. The coroner arrived, peeling back layers of time from her fragile form. The body was mummified, dried out, preserved by a force more unnatural than decay. 3 months at least. That was the estimate. She had been dead all this time. But if that was true, then who turned on the light? The officers searched the house, moving methodically through each room. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the dust. No misplaced objects. No explanation. A squatter, they decided. It had to be. Someone had been living here, tending to the house, eating meals in the kitchen, turning the light on at night. But no footprints. No fingerprints. Nothing. The house swallowed their questions in silence. The police left, but the feeling remained. Even after the flashing lights of their cars disappeared down the street. Even after they locked the house, sealed the door with yellow tape, the sensation lingered. Something had settled into the air, something thick and suffocating, like a presence that had been disturbed but not removed. Back in his own home, he tried to convince himself that it was over. That Mrs. Holloway had simply died alone in her bed, that her house had been empty all this time. But his mind rejected it. The light had turned on. The kitchen had smelled of food, fresh enough that condensation still clung to the plate. And then there was the shadow behind the curtain. The questions gnawed at him. Then he remembered the camera. It had been installed last spring, one of those simple security cameras mounted just above her front door. She'd been excited about it, telling anyone who would listen that now she could see who was at her doorstep before opening it. He had humored her at the time, never expecting it to matter. But now it did. The officers had taken the footage for review. He forced himself to wait. Rationally, he knew it would show nothing. A squatter, a thief, some stray figure moving through the house. He told himself this, convinced himself of it, until the police sent over the report. And then he saw it. The footage began like any other, clear, still frames of the house's entrance. Nothing remarkable. The days blurred together, sunlight shifting across the porch as mail and newspapers accumulated. A few neighborhood cats passed through, their tails flicking indifferently. Time pressed forward in an unbroken, predictable sequence, until night fell. At exactly 8:42 p.m., the upstairs light flicked on. The footage continued, time-stamped and unquestionable. Yet no one had entered. No movement at the front door, no shape shifting behind the curtains. Just the sudden, unnatural glow from the window above. Then, at some point in the early morning hours, it shut off again. The next night, the same thing. 8:42 p.m. sharp. This pattern repeated for days, weeks. But no one was there. Then there was the mail. In the early footage, the front porch overflowed with letters, newspapers, advertisements. A pile growing steadily, untouched. And yet, somewhere between midnight and dawn, the pile shrank. Piece by piece, the envelopes vanished. No hands reached for them. No flicker of movement in the frame. Just empty space where something should have been. Then came the final recording of Mrs. Holloway. She appeared in the window one evening, her face barely visible behind the lace curtain. The footage was clear. She was there unmistakably. Only, she did not move. Her frame remained in that exact position for 3 consecutive nights. The same tilt of the head, the same vacant gaze directed at the street below. At first, it could have been overlooked, mistaken for a still frame error, but then something changed. Her shadow, while her body remained frozen, the shadow behind her shifted, just slightly, just enough. A slow, unnatural movement, independent of any external light source. It elongated, receded, stretched to the side as if something behind her was stirring. But Mrs. Holloway herself never moved again. Not once. Then, on the 4th night, she was gone. The footage should have been enough to keep him away. It should have been enough to convince him that there were things in this world better left unexplored. But obsession had a way of hollowing a man out, filling the empty spaces with questions that had no answers. And the house, Mrs. Holloway's house, was a wound in the neighborhood, a festering thing that refused to heal. The police had locked it up, taped the doors, declared it vacant. No one spoke of it anymore. It was just another dead place on the street, another home that would eventually be sold off, gutted, and remodeled until its past was wiped clean. but he knew better. He watched it at night. He told himself he wasn't waiting for anything, but his eyes always found their way to the upstairs window. The light never came on again after the police had left, but something about the house still felt occupied. And then one night, he couldn't stop himself. The street was silent, the houses asleep. He stepped across the road, moving like a man in a trance, his breath shallow and controlled. The front porch groaned under his weight, an old wooden exhale. The door should have been locked. It wasn't. The knob turned too easily, the lock clicking open with an unsettling softness, as if something inside had been expecting him. He stepped in. The air inside was wrong. Not stale, not abandoned. The house hadn't settled into the quiet lifelessness of an empty place. Instead, the air was thick, damp, humid in a way that made the walls feel closer than they should be. A scent clung to the space, something faintly metallic, something that did not belong in the world of the living. His footsteps pressed into the wooden floor, and with each step, the house shifted beneath him, as if he were walking across something not entirely solid. It groaned, softly, rhythmically, like breathing. The kitchen remained unchanged. The plate still sat on the table, though the food had begun to rot, curling in on itself. He ignored it, moving through the hall, past the narrow staircase leading up. Upstairs, his feet hesitated, but his body knew where he was going. The floorboards creaked in protest under his weight as he ascended. The air thickened, pressing against his skin, his lungs. At the top of the stairs, the bedroom door stood open. The bed, where Mrs. Holloway's body had been found, was empty. The sheets were disturbed, wrinkled, as if someone had just risen from it. The indentation on the mattress remained, the imprint of a body that was no longer there. The closet door was open, just slightly, a sliver of darkness beyond the wood. Something about it felt off. The air near the closet was warmer, the smell stronger, denser. The walls here were different, less solid, almost damp to the touch. And then he saw it, the opening, a narrow, blackened gap inside the closet, a passage leading into the walls of the house. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, the air inside the walls thick and damp. It smelled of something festering, something old. The phone flashlight jittered in his grip, casting shaky beams of light against the scratched wood. The tunnel was narrower than it first seemed, pressing in on both sides, forcing him forward in a slow, crouched crawl. The walls bore deep, uneven scrapes, marks left by fingers, not tools. Some scratches overlapped, as if multiple hands had clawed at the same spots over time. The thought sent a cold pressure into his chest, but he kept moving. His hand brushed against something brittle. A broken fingernail wedged into the wood. He swallowed back bile. The passage twisted slightly, narrowing further. The air was hotter here, thicker, oppressive. A sound reached his ears, so faint he almost mistook it for the settling of the house. A breath, not his own. The flashlight quivered as he aimed it forward. Shadows stretched and recoiled. Then, something solid. A pile of tangled blankets, matted and darkened with grime. Not blankets. A nest. Layers of old clothes, newspaper clippings curled with moisture, a sleeping bag stiff with age. The flashlight revealed a half-eaten plate of food, congealed grease pooling around cold remnants. Beside it, a knife. His stomach clenched. Something moved ahead, a slow shift in the dark, not the rustling of rodents or the flutter of insects. He heard it, a deliberate movement, a body adjusting. Heavy, human. His light caught it. A foot, bare, dirt-caked, protruding from the shadows. Then a knee, dragging forward. The smell became unbearable. Sweat, rot, stale breath. The flashlight beam trembled over a face. Gaunt, pale under streaks of filth. Eyes sunken hollow, yet wide, far too wide. The pupils swallowed the color, black wells of something too starved, too unhinged. A body folded into itself, bones pressing against skin, the tremble of shallow, labored breathing. The thing in the crawl space was not a thing at all. The house had never been empty. It had been waiting. His foot slipped against the damp wood as he scrambled back, the flashlight beam jolting wildly. The man in the shadows shifted, his body unfolding in unnatural, jerky motions. Limbs that had been cramped for too long flexed stiffly, testing their strength. The knife glinted. The man was still at first, his head tilting slightly, as if he were listening. Then he moved, so fast, faster than he should have been able to in such a confined space. The light fell. A weight crashed into him, bone-thin but impossibly strong. The air ripped from his lungs as fingers dug into his shirt, forcing him down, nails catching in flesh. The flashlight rolled, spinning light in fractured glimpses. A hollowed face inches from his own, breath sour, wet, heavy. A sharp pain bloomed in his stomach. He choked. The knife was inside him. His own breath came in strangled gasps, his mind screaming at his body to move, to fight, but the weight pressing down was relentless. Hands gripped his arms, forcing them still. Hot breath on his cheek. Another twist of the blade. He didn't realize he was making a sound until the world around him blurred. A thin, wheezing noise, his own. The pressure in his chest built, drowning out everything else. His vision dimmed, edges darkening. The last thing he saw was the man's face, his lips moving soundlessly, forming something between words and laughter. Then nothing. Days passed before anyone noticed. His mailbox grew full. A neighbor glanced at his house one evening, frowning at the untouched newspapers piling on the porch. The lights inside remained off, the curtains unmoved. Eventually, someone knocked. No answer. The house sat silent. By the time anyone thought to check, it was too late. When they found him, his body had already cooled. His bed was made. His kitchen was oddly clean. And in the crawl space, nestled deep in the walls, a single plate of food had been left half-eaten,